Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you may be joining us from. I'm very impressed by looking at the chat and seeing the global participation we have that is so fitting for World Water Day 2021. My name is Jay Famiglietti. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Institute for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm your host. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is being hosted by the University of Saskatchewan, which is on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place, and we reaffirm our relationship with one another. We know that many of you are joining us from around the world, and I hope that you'll take a moment to acknowledge and pay respect to one another as well. Now, it's my great pleasure to again be moderator and host for this Let's Talk About Water Community Forum. Let's Talk About Water began as a film and water symposium founded by our dear friend and film historian Linda Lilienfeld, with the goal of making science communication on water issues and climate change more accessible and enjoyable. This forum is a way for us to do just that. Today, I'm so thrilled to be celebrating World Water Day with you. The UN theme for this year's World Water Day is valuing water. And what better way to learn, explore, and expand on the value of water than to have stimulating conversations with amazing panelists. On top of our conversation, here today we'll have two films you can watch for free, Brave Blue World and Connect the Drops with NASA data. And we were watching in the run-up to opening up, we were watching a preview of Brave Blue World. Check out letstalkaboutwater.ca after this event, where you can screen free films that dive deeper into this topic. Just a few ground rules for the audience. Our last forum went pretty well, and we only had 15 minutes for questions last time. This time we're going to expand that to 30 minutes after the formal discussion. Please type your questions into whichever platform you may be using, along with your name, where you're joining us from. And you can also use hashtag LTAWLive if you like. You can ask any of the guests or myself, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Now, let's get to our guests. Today, I'm joined by three individuals, each with a unique perspective on valuing water: Kirsten James, Guillaume Bromberg, and Karen Kidd. Kirsten James is the Program Director for Water at CERES. CERES is a nonprofit organization transforming the economy to build a just and sustainable future for people and for the planet. She directs strategy for mobilizing leading investors and companies to address the sustainability risks facing our freshwater and agricultural systems. Her work includes leading the Valuing Water Finance Initiative, an investor-led effort which seeks to drive corporate action on water-related financial risks, and in which our University of Saskatchewan team here at the Global Institute for Water Security is participating. Guillaume Bromberg is the co-founder and for 25 years the Israeli director of EcoPeace Middle East. EcoPeace Middle East is a unique organization that brings together Jordanian, Palestinian, and Israeli environmentalists with their primary objective being the promotion of cooperative efforts to protect shared environmental heritage. Guillaume has also written extensively on the relationship between water issues and Middle East peace and has presented before the UN Security Council, the US Congress, European Parliament, and other international forums. And Karen Kidd. Karen Kidd is an ecotoxicologist studying how the health of aquatic organisms and food webs are affected by human activities and the fate of pollutants in freshwater ecosystems. She's the Jaroslawski Chair in Environment and Health at McMaster University, and she's held a Canada Research Chair in Chemical Contamination of Food Webs from 2004 through 2017 at the University of New Brunswick. She leads a multidisciplinary research lab at McMaster, which includes ecology, biogeochemistry, chemistry, and toxicology, and she works on lakes, rivers, wetlands, and coastal zones spanning tropical through Arctic climates.
Thank you.
World Water Day celebrates and raises awareness of water in the global water crisis. A core focus of the observance is to support the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goal, SDG number 6, water and sanitation for all by 2030. Before we start thinking about the future, like so many of us do on a daily basis, let's focus on the theme for World Water Day this year, valuing water. The theme, again, valuing water, it's about much more than price. Water has enormous and complex value for our households, for food, culture, health, education, economics, and the integrity of our natural environment. Without a comprehensive understanding of water's true multidimensional value, will be unable to safeguard water for the benefit of everyone. So what I'd like to do is start off by asking each of the panelists to give us a brief introduction to their work and how valuing water enters into it. And why don't we start with Karen?
Thank you so much, Jay. It's a real pleasure to be here. I grew up in the petrochemical capital of Canada in Sarnia, and I grew up on the shores of Lake Huron, and what I witnessed in this area is the conflict that arises between industrial production and demand for water and consumers' demands for their products. And then the conflict around the discharge of chemicals into the environment and the downstream impacts that this has on aquatic communities as well as human communities. And so I think that really influenced me getting into ecotoxicology and spending the last 3 decades looking at water pollution issues. So we've worked on oil refineries and agricultural runoff, also on municipal wastewater discharges, and really trying to understand the chemicals that we use on a daily basis and what the impacts of releasing them into our waterways are for the health of our aquatic systems.
Thanks very much, Karen. Kirsten.
Great. Well, happy World Water Day, everyone, and really great to be part of this discussion today. So as Jay mentioned, I'm the Water Program Director at Ceres. And for those of you who aren't so familiar with us, we're a nonprofit sustainability organization, and we work with really the most influential capital market leaders to look and hopefully solve the world's greatest sustainability challenges. So actually, I was looking, World Water Day is about 30 years old now, and Ceres is about in the same timeline. We were founded over 30 years ago in response to the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and actually a group of investors really had a vision in response to this catastrophe for a better way of doing business and really a redefined role and responsibility of companies being stewards of the environment. So to accomplish our mission, we really work through critical networks and global collaborations of investors, companies, and nonprofits. So our work specifically on water started over a decade ago, and really our theory of change is around reshaping how investors and companies value water, thereby making water stewardship really a business fundamental for these players. So by doing this and changing this paradigm, really helping to safeguard our global water supplies. So just to give you some color on sort of what our team does on a day-to-day basis, we work directly with companies to improve their water stewardship. So in particular, we've zeroed in on the food sector, which is particularly susceptible to water risk with their deep agricultural supply chains. So we have programs like our Ceres WWF Ag Water Challenge, which works with companies to develop leadership commitments in supply chains. And I'm excited to announce, and we can talk about more later, that we're announcing new members to our Ag Water Challenge. In fact, hot off the presses, Mars Incorporated joined us along with Ingredion and Danone today, making some bold new leadership commitments. So that's really exciting. And then in addition to working directly with companies, we're also working with networks of investors to engage those companies that they own around water risk and really using that as a leverage point. So we have coalitions, our Investor Water Hub, about 130 members engaging with companies and better understanding water risks in their portfolios, as hopefully we'll get a chance to talk more about later. Our Valuing Water Finance Task Force, which Jay and his team are very involved with. And so, you know, that's another example of the networks that we're working through. And then lastly, you know, to inform all of this work, we're developing a lot of research and thought leadership. We develop benchmarking such as what we call Feeding Ourselves Thirsty, which looks at how companies are managing their water risks, and this really helps inform a lot of the work we do. So anyways, that's a little bit about our focus at Ceres and how we're looking at the value of water, and really look forward to our conversation today.
Thanks very much, Kirsten. On to you, Gidon.
So thank you very much, Jay, and really wonderful to be here. And I really look forward to the discussion we're going to have on this, really critical occasion of World Water Day. So I think that no one values water more than when they feel that they don't have enough water for their daily lives or enough water to go around for basic needs. And I come from a part of the world which is perhaps one of the most water scarce part of the world, the Middle East and North Africa. And the organization that I co-founded 26 years ago, EcoPeace Middle East, is all about valuing water as an entry point for cooperation and for peace building. Many people have said in the past that water will be the main reason for wars in the future. Well, at EcoPeace Middle East, we don't think that's true at all. And we think that because of the unique value of water, the unique need that everyone needs water for the very basic aspects of life, water, if managed properly, can be a very powerful entry point for cooperation and for peace building. And that's what we do at EcoPeace Middle East. We're also a nonprofit organization, a civil society organization that's very uniquely made up of Palestinians and Jordanians and Israelis together. In fact, we're the only organization that exists that brings Palestinians, Jordanians, and Israelis under one roof. And that speaks already to the incredible value of water to promote cooperation. As an organization, we focus on two broad themes. Half of our programming is community-based, where we work with young people about understanding my water reality, my neighbor's water reality, and the interdependence between the two. So we work in schools, we develop curriculum. We've developed quite uniquely a curriculum on water diplomacy that is actually being taught in high schools around the region. We work with young professionals. We work with their parents and the schools and the mayors in the different communities that we work in. We managed to bring together the mayors of the Jordan River, Palestinian, Jordanian, and Israeli, to actually jump into the Jordan River together as a means to highlight that our destiny is very much intertwined, and our destiny is connected to the rehabilitation of our natural water resources, including this iconic river, holy to half of humanity. And then the second aspect of our work is focused on top-down advocacy, where we write reports, but quite uniquely, we write those reports bringing together Palestinian, Jordanian, and Israeli experts to co-author those reports, to be able to then speak in our respective languages to our respective governments and other decision makers. And then we benefit from the synergy of both bottom-up and top-down advocacy that we undertake in order to try and help create the political will needed to change the reality on the ground, to see that water is managed sustainably from a regional perspective and equitably shared, not only between our three peoples, but between the needs of people and the needs of nature. Back to you, Jay.
Thanks very much, Gidon. That was thank you everyone for those great introductions. So we also have a great diversity in the panel, which I think is quite rich. And as we were sitting in the green room, preparing or waiting to go live, I suggested to our panelists that we can have open conversation as well as me moderating questions. So I'm looking forward to do that. So I'd like to loop back to you, Kirsten. And so now we've just seen and heard that people value water in different ways. And when you are, so there are a lot of different ways, right? And when you are dealing with investors and you're trying to mobilize investors and companies, how do you deal with these differences? And we're doing it right now in the project that we have with you, right? So we come in it from a sort of environmental protection science point of view, but you're trying to communicate these risks to investors. So how do you balance that?
Yeah, no, that's an important question, and you definitely have to understand your audience and the motivations. So, we're ramping up our ongoing work to really build the business case for companies and investors to really compel them to act on water risk. So, we're trying to hone in on articulating the material risk to companies and the financial value at risk for the failure to act on these water impacts and water risks. So, we are weaving in multiple and various values as we articulate that case. I think they're all, very interrelated, and, there's externalities created by business as usual. So I think we can't forget all of the multiple values as we're building out our case. But, as Ceres hones in on sort of how we articulate and build the case for our main audience, which, as you mentioned, is companies and investors, we really think about it sort of from the framing of, the bottom line is that no company can survive or thrive without a clean, dependable supply of water. If you unpack this a little, water is essential for crops and livestock and making all of the products that we use every day and generating the power we need for our homes and businesses. And, the list goes on and on. But the problem that we're facing is that economic players really have treated water as though it's infinite. It has little value. And as a result, this has led to a lot of misuse and waste and inappropriate management of water. So this is obviously very short-sighted, as all of us around the table know. And, the reality is that water scarcity and water pollution are growing global financial risks to companies and investors. So, we typically break this down into sort of three categories, which I think helps really understand the financial implications and how we go about messaging this to companies and investors. So there's the physical risks, right? So too much or too little water can cause risks to companies. I was just reading in the news last night, our friends in Australia, last year they were in the news for severe droughts, and now in Sydney, they're facing severe floods. And I was reading that, their rail lines are being impacted and the transfer of goods. So, so every time you open the paper, there's similar stories. So the physical risks can be a problem. Also, regulatory risks. There's new regulations that come into play and can be a risk to companies if they're not managing their water resources appropriately. For example, in recent years, we've seen legislation in the US around combined animal feeding operations. And so that could obviously have big implications to meat companies. And then lastly, we talk about reputational risks. So, an example I've seen in the news a lot recently in this regard is, a brewery in Mexico may have a stranded asset of at least $900 million due to a community referendum because the community is concerned that, this brewery is coming in and they don't have sufficient water resources for the people and the community and the environment. So, these are all risks that we're facing. And actually, also to put it in perspective, Ceres did a bit of an analysis a few years back, and we looked at the holdings of some of the major indices, so the S&P 500, the Russell 3000, and a few others. And we found that over 50% of the holdings in these major indices have medium to high water risks. And so, this again just demonstrates that the risk is real and, we can't ignore it any longer. So, at Ceres, we believe we've made some good progress on mobilizing companies and investors on water stewardship. Our Investor Water Hub, which is a group of investors working on these issues, has grown significantly over the last 5 years. As I mentioned previously, companies have made some really notable commitments. But still, despite all that progress, there is still this large gap between the commitments and action we're seeing and the scale that is necessary to match the problem of our water crisis. And so, as you know, Jay, in an attempt to really change this paradigm, we've kicked off the Valuing Water Finance Initiative in partnership with the government of the Netherlands, and investors and NGOs and scientific stakeholders such as the University of Saskatchewan. And we're hoping that this initiative really takes us up to the scale that's really necessary, and that we can really unleash the power of investors to engage these important water users and polluters, and really ensure that we're appropriately valuing water. So just real briefly, how we plan to do this. We've developed a Valuing Water Finance Task Force, which is comprised of 14 leading global pension funds and banks. And just keep in mind, these are the universal owners. So they are the owners of all of these companies that are potentially causing impact to water resources. So they can be real great voices in this conversation and can help raise awareness of, the widespread impacts of corporate practices on water supplies. And, the task force is helping to ensure that our work really resonates and builds traction. Again, sort of that business case I mentioned at the beginning. And then we're also doing some important research to fill in those gaps that really can help us make that business case. So the work we're doing with Jay, you and your team, to help clarify which industries and practices are causing these severe impacts. We're going to be further quantifying the financial value at risk, and ultimately setting a clear set of expectations for companies that we can all join together and hopefully drive corporate action on water-related financial risks to a much greater extent. And so it's really exciting, and happy to chat more about that later in the conversation. But I think that really demonstrates sort of how Ceres is looking at building the case to better value water.
Thanks very much, Kirsten. So, Gidon, I'd like to ask you the same question. So you mentioned that valuing water is the entry point that brings people together in the 3 countries that you work with and the group of stakeholders, but there must be a variety of ways, financially, culturally, and so on, that the different stakeholders and your different EcoPeace members value water.
Absolutely. And I want to share with you perhaps 2 examples. In the midst of conflict, there are really no nice guys. People will act where they see a clear self-interest. And therefore we try to appeal to self-interest that lead to mutual gain. The conflict in the region has, for instance, led to the utter demise of this iconic river called the Jordan River, in its stretch from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea. And in our efforts to overcome that demise and the competition, in order to create cooperation towards the rehabilitation of the Jordan River, one of the means that we've helped establish is turning to the different religious communities. So, the 3 Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all identify tremendous cultural, religious value towards the Jordan River. Yet it's the peoples in our own region who make up mostly Muslims, Jews, and Christians that have been responsible for the demise of that river. So by appealing to religious leadership, by bringing together, firstly, working separately in the different faith-based organizations, but then by bringing together imams and priests and rabbis, both from the respective communities, but also globally, we've been able to bring tremendous attention to the fate of the river, to the understanding that this iconic river, so important to the cultural and religious background of at least half of humanity, has paid a tremendous cost. So firstly, raising awareness has been critical through, in partnership with the various religious communities. That's been a game changer, to work with the religious communities to raise awareness, but to then take it further and have religious communities show leadership in cooperation. And we've managed to have rabbis and priests and imams sign a covenant together, calling for the rehabilitation of the Holy Jordan River. So, that's led to the type of cooperation that would otherwise not see in this sadly conflict-ridden region. So valuing water from its religious and cultural perspective has been very important and very influential in our efforts to rehabilitate the River Jordan. Another aspect of, or another entry point for valuing water is from its national security perspective. If we promote an understanding that water insecurity leads to destabilization, that reduces the ability to promote climate resilience, particularly since our part of the world is a climate hotspot. While the rest of the world is worried about a 1.5 degree increase in temperatures, we're already experiencing that. We're fearful of a 4 degree Celsius increase in temperatures, which could make much of our region unlivable, certainly for the long summer months. By highlighting the national security implications of not having sufficient water, not only for your own people, but also for your neighbors, we are able to highlight the need to cooperate. And we have concrete examples. I mean, an underlying cause, not the only cause, but one of the causes that led to the uprising in Syria has been, the failure of water governance. And that failure didn't just stop in Syria. It led to millions of refugees crossing borders and has contributed to further water insecurity, for instance, in Jordan, with over 1.3 million Syrian refugees crossing the border in a country that prior to that refugee crisis was already one of the most water scarce places on earth. And then the combination of increased population through refugee and the direct implications of climate change on Jordan itself means that we see even further instability. And as an example, the capital of Jordan, Amman, which used to enjoy not 24/7 water, but used to enjoy water supply by the municipality 2 days a week, is now receiving only water for 8 hours a week, and promoting the understanding that that increased insecurity can lead to further national destabilization. And what happened in Syria could happen also in Jordan, and that promotes an understanding region-wide that all our countries need to be working together to make sure that we can increase climate resilience, that there is enough water to maintain national security interests, not only of each country, but region-wide. Otherwise, the implications of that rising insecurity leads to national insecurity, not only for that country, but for the region as a whole. And in that way, we really are able to gain the attention of the highest level of decision makers. The prime ministers and presidents of our region are increasingly concerned of how water insecurity, not only for their own country, but for their neighboring countries, could lead to further destabilization. So, 2 examples from our work at EcoPeace of how to raise the value of region-wide water security as a national security issue, as a cultural and religious issue of shared value. to all of us in the Middle East.
Thanks, Guido. I don't think people think very much about what you just expressed to us, which is sort of the positive feedback, the water insecurity in one region, then leading to destabilization in the surrounding countries and for the region. So thank you for sharing that with us. Karen, I'd like to turn to you now. And so we're bringing these different experiences. And so I kind of want to ask you a two-part question. One is that you brought up a different kind of conflict, right, in your opening remarks, this sort of conflict between industry versus municipalities, and the different needs. And so I'm curious about the experiences you've had with how those two broad groups value water, and also then what you think is the biggest threat to water right now, and how that might factor in.
Well, I'll start with the second one. I think the biggest threat to our waters is our really heavy reliance on synthetic chemicals and our increasing use of chemicals on a daily basis. Like, we're so heavily reliant on them for industrial food production, for the products that we use, our pharmaceuticals, personal care products for health and well-being. And society, I think, needs to put the brakes on. It's great to be working with industries to reduce their emissions, to reduce their use of water. But at the same time, I also think we need to step back and think about the chemicals that we're demanding as a society and that we rely on, because I don't believe that we need all of them. I think sometimes we're convinced that we need them. And one of my pet peeves is antimicrobials that are put in hand soap, for example. We think that they make the soap more effective for cleaning our hands, but it's unnecessary and causes downstream impacts for fish. So for me, the biggest change that needs to happen is a really hard look at our production of chemicals, our use of chemicals, and because we know they get released, ultimately ending up in surface waters, and many of them over the decades and decades we've been using them have shown that they're boomerangs. So they don't break down, they concentrate in our food web and come back to cause effects on the fish-eating wildlife, humans. And now we're increasingly recognizing that those mixtures that are out there in the environment are having long-term impacts on diseases in humans and wildlife as well. So I think that's, to me, the biggest source of conflict right now is changing that mentality, that we need to have more designer chemicals. And if you look at the statistics, they're talking about a doubling in the chemical sales globally from, $5.67 trillion. And we have over 140,000 chemicals on the market these days. So how do you possibly assess what's happening to those chemicals once they're released in the water? So it's about valuing water and not treating it like a garbage bin.
So I want to just jump in there, Karen. So our past conversation is equally as, I won't say depressing, but, there's real challenges out there. And so what you're really talking about is really hitting the demand side, right? The consumer demand side. So how do we get that message out, especially with so many, what did you say, 140,000 different chemicals? I mean, keeping track of it all is quite a challenge, but how do we get consumers to focus on it and to demand that we want less of these things? I mean, don't I want my new microbial charcoal face wash? Don't I need that?
I think that's a tough question for me to answer. I've been thinking about this a lot and how to affect change. We know that individuals collectively have a lot of can have a lot of social license with companies. And if it's getting that message out through social media, campaigns, I think we really need to throw everything at it, except the kitchen sink, or maybe even the kitchen sink. But
Kitchen sink might help. That would have an impact. Yeah. That would hurt.
So it's about sober second thought, and I think companies are increasingly recognizing that social license. In the pharmaceutical industry, for example, they're starting to look really hard at their manufacturing facilities and identifying ones with poor practices and affecting change in those companies, because we don't want large amounts of antibiotics discharged to our rivers. We know that has impacts for the ecosystem.
Right. So, Kirsten, I wonder if you want to jump in with a comment sort of on the investor side and, the whole sort of social license thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a very important consideration, and definitely, a risk that we see playing out in real time. And so, Karen's comments really resonate in terms of, Jay, what we're working on together with the Valley and Water Finance Initiative, and with really trying to understand, are there certain practices such as chemical use and discharge that we really need to change in industry. And we saw in some of the films that we watched for today, Brave Blue World, some of the examples of the apparel industry, for example, implementing different technologies to have zero liquid discharge and really better understanding the chemicals. I know a number of apparel companies that Ceres works with have joined together on various hazardous chemical initiatives. And, there's still a lot that needs to be done, but I think industry can be part of the solution. I know in California, where I live, the state has done a lot on green chemistry and how we can transition to greener chemicals. So I think definitely there's a lot that companies need to be aware of, and ensuring that they're not contributing to the pollution issues that Karen so nicely articulated.
Thanks very much. So I wanted to turn back to you, Kirsten, to you piqued my interest with your comment about the Ag Water Challenge. And can you just explain to that to us a little bit? And you've got some new partners.
Yeah, of course. So, the Ag Water Challenge is an effort that Ceres and WWF have collaborated on since 2016. And the idea behind it is, especially focusing on the food sector, where we see, the food sector taking about 70% of the global water resources, that we have, that really we need to focus on this sector and drive leadership commitments. There's a lot of, companies that we work with, which really are out ahead of others. We see this in our biannual benchmark, Feeding Ourselves Thirsty, that Ceres produces every other year. And, there's a lot of positive change that we're seeing, but there's also, a long way to go. And so we have worked with this set of companies to really create these leadership commitments, especially around supply chains, where we see this impact, and really work with them to set an example. And hopefully, the theory of change is that when you have these leading companies that are setting these bold commitments and implementing them and finding ways to succeed and meeting them, that we can really, have a domino effect and really have, the systemic change that we're looking for in ag supply chains. So, like I said, we kicked off the Ag Water Challenge back in 2016, and we conducted a suite of interviews early last year with the 9 companies that were participating with us and many other stakeholders, to really hone in on sort of, okay, we've had these great commitments, we're making good progress, but where do we really need to focus to get the change that we're looking for in ag supply chains? And so we decided for 2021 to narrow the focus and really hone in on soil health and nutrient management, and to really focus on commitments in that realm, and specifically looking at collective action to implement those commitments, and also financial mechanisms to help the growers and farmers implement these practices. And we've really, through our interviews and research, really seen as, collective action and financial incentives and technical support really helps drive the change and the impact that we need on the ground. So like I said, today Mars Incorporated joined us with the Ag Water Challenge, and a couple weeks ago Danone North America and Ingredion also joined us, and we're hoping to have many more come on board in the coming months. So a call to those companies on the line. Would love to have you join us. But again, we're hoping that these leadership commitments can really help show how it's done and how it can be done, and how we can create those positive water outcomes on the ground. So really excited to have these three new commitments, and looking forward to many more, and sort of that domino effect in the coming months.
Thanks, Kirsten. Gidon, did you want to follow up on this or last point?
I did. I mean, I think it's so important to speak to the life cycle issues around how goods are manufactured, so that when the water is utilized. I hate the word wastewater or sewage, because it's seen as something that it's really not. It's not rubbish. It's not something that we should just dispose. It becomes a resource, and given that in so many of the water scarce parts of the world, treating wastewater turns it into a very valuable resource. But if we're not governing, if we're not managing, if we're not understanding the full life cycle value, and we're putting in chemicals that we have no idea what implications they will have when we reuse the treated wastewater, or if we know in advance that, such as hormones, that we struggle, to have the capacity to remove those hormones, from, or other pharmaceutical products from our wastewater stream, then we actually know in advance that we're adding these harmful chemicals in our wastewater, in the reuse of that wastewater. And let me give you an example. In Israel, where I come from, half the agriculture produced is grown on treated wastewater. And if we're using, and that is certainly the direction for all semi-arid parts of the world, and with climate change, perhaps for most of the world, that we will all be treating our wastewater and valuing that as an important contributor. That if we're not, I think as Karen had said, if we're not really careful in thinking things through, then we're actually poisoning ourselves, and we mustn't do that. So we really need to control these chemicals, to understand what chemicals we're contributing to our water cycle. Otherwise, in the end, we do pay the price, both at the human level and certainly at the broader ecosystem level.
Mm-hmm. I'll just jump in and say it's so much easier to control at the source. And a great example of that in Canada recently was the ban of microbeads in cosmetic products. Rather than having to try and remove them from municipal wastewaters, which is nearly impossible, it was much smarter, as a nation to take them out of the products and remove that source.
Exactly.
Thanks. Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Karen. So I just wanted to follow up with you, and given all this stuff that ends up in our waters, two-part question. I mean, I think many people around the world have this notion that there is some source of pristine water that we're going to keep, be able to tap into. And I wonder, if you think people will ever get away from that, or do you think that they really have the understanding of all the things, all the chemical constituents that end up in our waters? Not all of them, but just do they have the knowledge that our water is?
No, as a
not
scientist, I
quite
have
what
no
it might be.
idea what ends up, all of what ends up in our waters, because we're only monitoring the tip of the iceberg. When you think about 140,000 chemicals on the market worldwide, we only look at maybe 1,000 or several thousands of them. So it's a huge black box. But that being said, I think people are increasingly recognizing, through things like the One Health movement, increased communication and education, that waters are becoming increasingly contaminated, and it's hard to find those virgin waters that you're talking about, and that we need to respect water as a resource, given how critical it is for us.
Okay, thanks very much, Karen. Yeah, I'm troubled by that. And just a follow-up question. So, and I'm not actually familiar with the regulatory process in Canada. So, what would it take if, say, your lab identified some real dangers from some new chemical? What would it take to get regulatory action?
Well, there's a strong chemical management program in place in Canada, that they have a list of chemicals that they're reviewing regularly. They review how they're used, where they go, the risks to environmental health and human health. And when they identify, unnecessary risks, either to humans or the environment, those chemicals are reduced or restricted in their use. So it's a process that doesn't happen overnight, unfortunately, but several times there's been public pressure, to remove plasticizers from baby bottles, for example, or microbeads from cosmetics. And that certainly helps raise awareness towards reducing our use of harmful chemicals.
Okay, thanks very much, Karen. Okay, so although we didn't have to watch Brave Blue World as a prerequisite to our conversation, there's some really, as Kirsten mentioned, there's some passionate and intelligent innovators out there working on our water problems. So I'd like to hear from each of you about some innovations that you think can help us in the solution space: technology, data, collaborations, anything that you're excited about or you might want to see in the future. And Karen, I'll start back with you. We'll go in reverse order. Go back, start with you.
Well, something I'm super excited about that was in the movie was this, and Guidon talked about this too, was this re-envisioning of wastewaters as a resource and not a waste. And so the example in Kenya and the one in Chicago, where we're pulling phosphorus out of wastewaters, capturing that source of phosphorus for agriculture, is fantastic, because to me that's a win-win-win. We win because we have this resource of phosphorus and energy. We win because we're putting less phosphorus into aquatic systems, so we're reducing eutrophication. And then we also win because when you treat wastewaters as a resource, and you have increased processing of these the waters, you reduce the release of synthetic chemicals. So for me, it's a fantastic opportunity to not only benefit from the waste, have human benefits, but also environmental benefits from changing our mindset around municipal wastewaters.
Guidon, how about you?
So one of the issues that I'm really excited about, and Ecopeace has actually completed a research study on, is the issue of desalination. Now, desalination, we believe, should be the last choice, should be the technology of last choice, that we need to employ everything else related to good governance and pricing and conservation. But in many areas of the world, even after you employ all of these efforts, we simply still don't have enough water because of population issues in particular, and declining freshwater availabilities. And one of the programs that we're really excited about is combining desalination to meet those needs, but through renewable energy, through powering desalination through solar and wind, and by doing it in a manner that creates healthy cross-border interdependencies. And to be more specific, we're really excited about Jordan, with its vast desert areas, having the comparative advantage to produce renewable energy at cheapest prices. And we're the technology for, in particular, photovoltaic has advanced to such a degree that solar energy in sunny parts of the world, such as ours, is the cheapest source of electricity. So we're not doing a favor anymore. It's cheaper than any other type of fossil. It doesn't need any support or subsidy. And if we can utilize the hinterland areas such as Jordan, to produce large quantities of renewable energy, and have Jordan sell that electricity, that renewable electricity, to the coastal countries, in this case Israel and Palestine, and use solar energy to desalinate Mediterranean water, so to reduce the ecological footprint of desalination, and then increase dramatically the water pie, so that we don't have to experience the vast and scary water insecurity that the region is currently facing, and then not only use that desalinated water for the water security needs of Israelis and Palestinians, but then to sell that additional desalinated water to help produce water security also for Jordan. We create very healthy interdependencies. It's not just, of course, based on water, it's based on water and energy that can lead to both water and energy security region-wide, create revenue streams that integrate our economies, that create the foundation for regional stability. And when we look at what was done, last century in Europe, not on water and energy, but on coal and steel, which were last century the most critical natural resources that helped bring peace and stability to the European continent. Well, we think that this century, facing the climate crisis in the Middle East, harnessing the sun and the sea can be the engines for not only climate mitigation and climate adaptation, but for actual stability and peace building in the troubled Middle East. So, water, as I said from the outset, harnessing the sun and harnessing the sea can really be the entry points to bring stability and perhaps even peace, to very troubled areas of the world, such as the Middle East.
Thanks, Gidon. Kirsten, anything to add to the innovation side?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just, echo the theme of my colleagues that really maximizing every drop of water. There's a lot of technologies and efforts and solutions out there through stormwater capture and recharge and recycling and conservation and efficiency. And so I think all of that work is extremely promising and necessary and exciting. The one thing I'll add, I think in this sort of vein of innovation and really, what is needed to move the ball forward that we're seeing is really, this movement around collective action. And so, we really need to get our head around that we can't fix water issues by ourselves. We need a big tent of collaborators, and we've seen some really interesting collaborations among companies and other partners. Ceres developed a collective action effort on public policy engagement in California, recognizing that public policy needs to be a key piece of the solution and water management. There's been interesting other initiatives on the collective action side. The California Water Action Collaborative is one that I'm familiar with, where companies are coming together and implementing projects and really sort of moving towards this trend of net positive, and that it's no longer enough for companies to just reduce their own water or use or eliminate their own pollution, but really must focus on becoming resource positive and giving back more than they take from the planet. And so I think that's really a theme that these collective action efforts can really help drive us towards, which is really exciting. So hard to pick and choose, but those are a few of the bright spots I see.
Okay, thanks, Kirsten. So that's a nice pivot to, let's just do one last question where I solicit answers from all three of you, and you sort of hit on it already, Kirsten, and then we'll open up the questions to the audience. But when we think about SDG number 6, clean water and sanitation for all, what is holding us back from achieving this goal? Is it politics, policy, innovation, cultural issues? And so, Karen, we'll start with you. Surprise!
I know. I think like Kirsten says, it's an issue that needs tackling from lots of different directions, and I think all of what you mentioned is critical to addressing this. From my perspective, I think consumerism really is driving a lot of our water pollution issues, and that mentality that we need the latest, greatest, we need to look 10 years younger than we are. So I'm
trying to achieve that with my Zoom filter. I don't know if it's working. It's a very cheap way.
It's working. You'll have to share your secret with us after. Yeah. So I think it's flipping that mentality on its head and recognizing that we don't need all of these products.
Yeah. So you call it consumerism, and I think we're all victims of it. And at a base level, I call it greed. I mean, I think that we are pretty comfortable in many parts of the world, pretty comfortable in our lifestyles, and yeah, it's there is a whole social behavioral side, right, to understanding how to drive change that I think like people like us, you and I, need to try to integrate into our research.
Absolutely.
So, Guido, how about you? What are some thoughts on major obstacles?
So I think that if we all agree that water is a public good, then I think that we also then need to focus on governance and to make sure that regulations are in place. That first of all, regulating water as a public good is completely justified, and that we should expect that, we should encourage and support that from our legislators, from our agencies, that it's absolutely critical that water resources are governed in a way that speak to sustainability, to make sure to me when I visit parts of North America, and I come and hear that if you own the land, you also own the water under the land. Well, that's crazy from where I come from. I mean,
welcome to our world.
How can you deal with water equity and sustainability issues if everyone can just come and pump the water that's under their feet and have a sense that the water's mine because I own the land where the water flows, if it's surface water or where the water is found, if it's groundwater. If there isn't the governance structure that reflects water as a public good, then we're not going to be able to achieve the results that I think that we're looking for, which is sustainability of water usage, of water equity, to make sure that there's not only water valued and available for people, but also enough water left for nature. Because how do we get to hear nature's voice, and how do we get to hear the importance of sufficient and clean water in all of our rivers if water is seen as a private good, if water is only seen as a commodity. So to me, technology is important, education is important, but primarily, if we don't have the governance structures in place that reflect water being a public good, then we're not going to able to achieve the objectives and the goals that I think that we've talked about as far as sustainability and equity and water for nature.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. Kirsten, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're just going to need all the tools in the toolbox. So all of the above. I mean, from Ceres' perspective, as I've mentioned, we really need to see the investor and business community make water management business fundamental. And so that's, I think, really key for us to get to SDG 6. Also we need, investment in solutions. A lot of those great technologies we heard about in the film, we need the capital going into those solutions, and a lot of our investor partners are doing just that. So I think that's a key piece. I think governance and public policy, as I've mentioned before, is a key piece that, at all levels of government, whether it's, the local watershed level, the state level, the country level, we need that governance structure supporting all of this work if we're gonna, make it to the finish line. Our colleagues at CDP put out a report a few weeks ago just outlining, the magnitude of the cost of action and mitigating these issues is so much less than the cost of inaction. And so, we really need all the players and all the stakeholders and broaden the tent and work to get us to the finish line and meet those SDG goals, which is going to be challenging, but we can put these solutions together and hopefully make some good progress.
All right, thanks very much. I think we're at the point in our time together where we want to start to take questions from the audience. And I'm not sure where those questions are going to show up on the screen. They're going to show up on the screen. Great. Is that in the chat or just going to pop up on the screen? I'm talking to our producer. We're waiting. It's just a drum roll. It's anticipation. Here we go. Okay, so Sean is going to do some filtering. Okay, how can we ensure safe and potable water to the poor countries through laws or methods or regulations? And Guidon, we'll toss this one to you.
Sure. So I think if we're talking about transboundary waters, then there's international legal principles that need to be considered about the fair share between all riparians of any shared body of water. But even so that all countries, irrespective of whether they're upstream or downstream or rich or poor, can have a fair allocation. So, international legal principles here are important. But even at the domestic level, often we find that the poorer the person, the poorer the population, the more that they tend to pay for water resources. And I think we need to go to the heart of those issues and how that happens, that there should be a scaling. There should be a system in place where water is subsidized for the poor, to make sure that minimum quantities of water can be available for basic needs, but that very quickly once you've met those needs, that then water truly reflects its full value. Its full value as in relation to scarcity, its full value in relation to the needs of water for nature, water for your neighbors, so that if water beyond meeting those minimal needs to meet basic human hygiene and cooking and cleaning and so forth, that then water becomes relatively expensive, and so that it's really valued for its importance and for its scarcity, and to encourage conservation both at the domestic level, at agriculture. So in most parts of the world, water for agriculture is distributed almost for free, if not for free, and therefore there's no incentive for agriculture, which in many parts of the world is the greatest consumer of water, to not invest in water conservation technologies. And when water then becomes freed up, from agriculture to other purposes, then the needs of the poor can be better met, so that we don't see the great disparity where poor communities can pay a very heavy price, and then farmers, whether they're poor or rich, but generally the larger farmers that are relatively wealthier are receiving water for nothing, or are receiving water at a heavily subsidized price. So I think that it's a complicated issue, and it's very specific to the circumstances in place. But when we value water to meet the different needs and prioritize water for the poor as a high priority issue, then I think that we go a long way in understanding and then helping solve that issue, so that water for the poor can be prioritized.
Thanks, Gidon. Some very thought-provoking stuff and some great ideas. Next question: how the water crisis due to climate change can be addressed properly to make minimum interventions? So why don't I start off, kick this one off, and see if any of the panelists want to add to it. So it's a difficult problem. And as we look around the world, climate change is driving the redistribution of water from the mid-latitudes to the high and low latitudes. We've got increasing amounts of flooding and drought, increasing in intensity and in frequency. We've got ice melting in the glaciers and the ice sheets, and up here in Canada, we're warming at twice the global rate. In Saskatchewan, 3 times the global rate. In Northern Canada, 4 times the global rate. Things are just melting away. Anything that we can do to mitigate, so in terms of minimal intervention, anything that we can do to mitigate climate change will have an impact on water, right? Anything we can do to slow down the pace of change for climate change will be helping on the water side, because water is really the sort of the vector that delivers the climate change message to your front door. That said, we have a lot of challenges ahead with respect to dealing with the flooding and dealing with the drought. And so awareness becomes important, planning becomes important. If you're talking about minimal intervention, then we're really talking about planning and governance. And, I think of intervention, I'm thinking of like building infrastructure. So short of that, then we're talking about planning, governance, and all the other things that we've talked about here. Changes on the demand side will be very, very important. In particular, when we think about the disappearance of groundwater around the world, how that will probably accelerate due to climate change, because the aquifers that are most used are in the arid and semi-arid parts of the world. They're becoming drier. They'll have less opportunities for replenishment, and so we have to get a handle on the demand side there. So I will toss this open to my fellow panelists to see if there's anything they want to follow up with.
I can just add, a few thoughts. I mean, I think when we're working with the corporate world, rightly so. A lot of our company partners are, making bold climate commitments, and that's terrific. We're also, as I've mentioned, seeing traction on the water side, but really thinking, as companies plan their sustainability efforts, thinking holistically, what are the climate outcomes and what are the water outcomes, and things like land use management and soil health, and looking at scope 3 emissions. I think there's a lot of synergies there. So to get to the question, I think if we're thinking more holistically, I think we can certain interventions can have co-benefits and multiple outcomes that could advance water outcomes and climate outcomes. So I think we need to think more holistically as we approach these issues.
Thanks, Kirsten. Okay, next question. Indirectly, how can we establish more integrative metrics for valuing actions that promote the conservation of water resources, considering the multifunctionality of agricultural landscapes? That's a complicated question. Should I read it again? Oh, you all can see, our panelists can see the question, right? So I will leave that one open and see who wants to jump on it.
So I'm happy to give it a start. So I'm not sure about, I don't think we have time to go into what might be the metrics, but I think that, somewhat similar to the earlier question as well, we need a whole of government approach. It's not just, the government that needs to take leadership. It's not just a regulation of industry and industry leadership. It's not just, consumer demand and consumer information. It's all of it together that we need to be monitoring, and that we need to be learning from the experiences from all of our respective societies and adapting them to the circumstances wherever we might be living. So I really think it's a whole of society approach that we need to understand, plan, and monitor. I really like, if the early question was also highlighting on climate change, I really like the European approach of a Green Deal, that the only way that we're going to overcome the tremendous challenge that climate change presents to us and sort of gain the outcomes that we're looking for is to plan it involving all aspects of society. And certainly not just seeing water issues as a water authority problem or an environmental problem. It's very much a whole of society issue, and we need to measure the outcomes from that whole of society approach, so that we can truly achieve greater sustainability, greater resilience, and protect our water resources in the most sustainable way.
Thanks, Gidon. I just wanted to speak to the integrative metric part of the question. I think it's really important, so I'm glad that it was raised. It's really challenging, and we understand the Earth system well enough, and water's integrated role in it, and its links to food and energy, and its role in coupling the land and the atmosphere and the ocean together, as well as biogeochemical cycles and ecosystem dynamics, that we need to be moving towards these more integrative metrics. I just want to point you to a project that I'm working on with some colleagues with National Geographic that's looking at a joint index of food, water, sort of scarcity risk index. So that's one stab at doing something like that. And even in our project with Ceres, which is called Evaluating Water Global Assessment, one thing that we talked about early on was some sort of overall metrics. How do you do these things that are more integrative? So more research is necessary, but it's an excellent point. I wanted to get to the next question, which is, in water restricted areas or countries, how do we prioritize? right? Drinking water, water for municipalities versus irrigation or versus industry, or water for energy production. Challenges that we face around the world. Anyone want to weigh in on that?
I can take a stab. So, I mean, this is a really important question. I think, it's something that needs to be explored when you're looking at industry practices. For example, there's a lot of tools out there. WRI, WWF have tools that help companies really understand, where, looking at geographies and really understanding where their footprint could have an impact on water quantity and supply and water quality, and really using that to help, if they have existing facilities, how can they really focus efforts and develop targets, and maybe science-based targets for fresh water, which is emerging in the field, and really focus on those watersheds where there are critical issues and be part of the solution. And so, there could be instances where, the corporate world can work with the watershed, can work with the communities, and help ensure that there are the safe drinking water supplies and other community needs. On the other hand, there might be instances where, companies should not have a footprint, or agricultural supply chains should not have a footprint. And actually, Ceres just released our 2030 roadmap for sustainability, which is a resource, as the name suggests, that really outlines a path for companies and how they achieve sustainability, and water resources is a key component of that. And the roadmap, contemplates there could be situations where if you can't bring that basin back into balance, that there shouldn't be capital deployed in some of those areas, or there shouldn't be certain crops grown in certain high-risk geographies. So, it's an important question that, needs to be evaluated as businesses make these decisions.
I also think that there's a challenge to us in the research community to put together the models and that with which we can test out the different scenarios, right? So turn the knobs of balancing, right, different competing water needs, and really understanding the full impacts of doing this or doing that. So I know that some of that exists, but I know as someone who works with computer models that we could be doing a much better job.
Jay, I'd love to comment on this one, because I live in a part of the world where water scarcity is very real, and those choices are being made every day. And it disturbs me greatly that water for people is not always seen as the first priority. I remember going to a school. I won't mention which country, but where there was no water to flush the toilets. And because there was no water to flush the toilets, girls were not being sent to school, because the boys can go out to the field, but for the girls, they're not allowed to go out to the field. So they stay home and they're denied an education. Yet there's water to grow bananas. There's water allocated, to grow fruits and vegetables, often tropical fruits and vegetables in the middle of the desert. I think that makes me angry. And as an organization, we advocate and we try to highlight that is unsustainable policies, that these are policies that discriminate, and we need to change those policies and recognize that water is a human right, and we need to prioritize, certainly when we compare the needs of water for basic human needs of drinking and cooking and sanitation. They must be met first before any other need. Otherwise, we're depriving populations of basic human rights. And sadly, in much of the world, this is prevalent every single day.
Thanks, Gidon, for that reality check. So here's a question. We've got some high school class listening. Thank you so much for listening. Hope you're still there. What is the most important role youth can play in this process? And I'll open that up to the panel.
Go ahead.
So we work a lot with youth. So half of our programming is with students and young people, and we often find that they are actually the agents of change. That they're the real leaders. That particularly in a conflict setting where there's distrust and there's reluctance to work with the other side, by first and foremost working with youth and undertaking programming, curriculum developed that helps you understand your water reality and your neighbor's water reality and the interconnectedness of those two, then we see that the young people are the ones demanding of their parents, of their mayors, of local government to, well, why aren't you working with the other side? If the rehabilitation of the River Jordan, as example, requires all peoples that live around the Jordan River to be working together to, as an example, get the sewage out, then we've often seen that it's the young people that are knocking on the doors of decision makers, and often they're the ones that are forcing the decision makers to act. And their voice is far more powerful. If a young person from the community is calling for the action, then the mayors, then decision makers are more likely to listen because that's part of their constituency. They're dependent on the support of their parents, of residents from their community. I described to you that one of our greatest, one of the photos that I like most is seeing the mayors of the Jordan River, Palestinian, Jordanian, and Israeli, jumping into the river together. Well, the only reason that they came to jump into the river together was because there was enough young people from each one of their communities calling on them, telling them, well, then you're not doing your job if you're not working with the other side, because if you need to rehabilitate the river and that requires working with the other side, then why aren't you doing that? And that has helped create the political will to see the type of actions that are needed.
Was it Kirsten or Karen that wanted to follow up?
Oh, I think it was me. Yeah, I agree with everything that's said. The youth is really critical. And, in my previous role, we did a lot of work with advancing public policy around plastic pollution. And it was just, I really saw the youth in action and helping to drive forward progressive policies in our community on these issues. And, as was already mentioned, the youth can really serve as messengers to the adults. I think there's a lot of lessons in this space from the climate side. We've seen such amazing advocates in our youth, and I think we can learn a lot from that and transfer it to hopefully greater traction with the youth on these critical water issues as well.
Thanks, Kirsten. I think we're going to take one more question and take a round of discussion on it, and then we will wrap it up. So there's a question about should we be thinking about measuring climate change and sustainability in a water footprint rather than a carbon footprint? So this is an idea we've talked about many times. We know there are some water footprint calculators out there. Just want to take some thoughts from the panel.
So I would say there's not instead of, it's in addition to, that we absolutely need, because if we're not counting the carbon, then we're not going to reduce the emissions in the way that we need to. But in addition to counting the carbon, we definitely need to evaluate from a resource use, from a water life cycle perspective, because that helps to educate the public. It helps to fine tune or introduce governance where the water footprint isn't being properly considered. Such as the example of growing bananas in the middle of the desert. People might think that that's ridiculous, but often, we see tropical fruits being grown in non-tropical areas at an incredibly high water footprint perspective. And if consumers were to know that and were to actually receive data, when they're shopping at the supermarket, that these are how many, in my language, cubic meters of water we utilized for this banana from a water scarce part of the world. So it's a difference if the bananas are grown in tropical areas and if the bananas are grown in water scarce or semi-arid areas, as to what that means for nature, for society in general. So it's not just the quantity of water, but how relative is water abundant or scarce in that area that needs to be incorporated into that thinking.
It's a great idea.
And I'll just add, I think, comparing water and climate, I think you really need to dive into that local level for water, obviously, and really understand that local level footprint. We've seen over time a lot of companies sort of reporting aggregate water use globally. And that only tells us a certain story. You really need to really get to that facility, local field level to really understand the real footprint and the real picture. But agree, both are critical.
I just wanted to add, you know what I think about growing bananas in the desert, Gidon? It's just bananas.
It is bananas, and again, it's the failure of that makes that so prevalent.
Yep, it's a little panel humor. Well, I lied and said that was going to be our last question, but we're going to do one more, and maybe this one is for me and you, Karen. What can the academic community do to better communicate science and all the work that's been being done to the grassroots community, to the general public?
Oh, we need to get out of our ivory towers, Jay, and talk to the media. Give public talks, have discussions, share our thoughts. Be willing to communicate our concerns.
Yeah, I agree. Much like when we talk about solutions, solution space and how we need a portfolio approach, I think the same thing is true on communication. There's no one thing. It's not like we're going to write an opinion piece and it's going to be transformational. It's not like you're going to give a lecture and it's going to be transformational. We need to do several of these things, and it's not like we all have to do all of them, but as a community we need to engage, and the getting out of the ivory tower and making the connections with the community is super important. But I also think it's really appreciated. I mean, any of the work that I've done when I speak publicly in town or engage in the community is greatly appreciated. People really like to see that we really actually care about water, and we care about like individuals and their access to water. Mm-hmm. Any last words? How about one last thought? We'll go around, and I'll do it. I'll go in the order that I see you on the screen. Gidon, last closing thought.
So at a time when we see a global outbreak of this virus, of COVID and climate change, I think that I hope that we wake up to the importance of science, that we mustn't take science for granted, that we need to base our decision making, including in the water sector, on good, sound science as that basis, that we need to counter populist politics that are often based on very narrow self-interests rather than certainly on any rational measure for decision making. And so that if we base our decision making on a sound water economy, on sound science instead of populism, then I think we'll do a much better job in managing our global water resources for all of the multiple uses that we need to achieve.
Thanks, Gidon. Kirsten, how about you? Any last thoughts?
As I've relayed throughout the session, I mean, water stewardship really needs to be seen as a business fundamental and communicated in a way that really demonstrates that there's no choice but for corporates to be part of the solution. And, you know, I think we're doing this through the Valuing Water Finance Initiative, and I hope folks on the line will get involved and join us with this important effort. But, you know, the bottom line is that we're working against the clock. And so we need to bring more stakeholders into the tent if we're going to meet SDG 6 by 2030. You know, a colleague said to me recently, we can get to 1.5 degrees, and that's going to take a lot of effort, but that's not going to help us as much if our water resources aren't there at the end of the day. So, you know, we really need to think of these issues holistically, get a broad tent, learn from the climate work, and communicate the water values at risk.
Thanks, Kirsten. Karen, you get the last word.
No pressure. Well, they say that it takes a village to raise a child, and I think it's going to take a village to tackle these issues. And I know we have lots of serious, some intractable water pollution issues, but I'm really heartened by the technologies that were discussed in the movie, you know, the movements that are afoot, the grassroots, ground up swelling of recognition for improving the health of our waters, our ecosystems, you know, and meeting the SDG goals.
Thanks very much. And thank you to all of our panelists and to all of our participants. We really appreciate your joining us today, panelists, and our participants from literally from around the world. Really amazing. Kirsten James, Gidon Bromberg, and Karen Kidd. It's again, always a pleasure to be speaking with you. Just a reminder to our audience, please visit the Let's Talk About Water.ca website to watch the films for free. And for more events, there's other films, there's our podcast, and find out how you could win $10,000 US by making a short 2-minute film about water. The panel discussion recording will also be available on Facebook, Twitter, and on YouTube. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us on World Water Day 2021. We'll see you all later.
Thank you very much, Jay.
Thanks, everybody.